Most of what follows comes from unsealed court filings, FBI records, and reporting from outlets like NPR, CNN, NBC News, and the Associated Press. Brad Pitt has denied the abuse allegations described in those filings. He was never charged with a crime, and no civil court has ever ruled that the alleged abuse occurred. Keep that in mind as you watch. This is the story of an allegation and a legal fight, not a verdict. September 14, 2016. A private jet, somewhere over the Atlantic, carrying two of the most photographed people on the planet and their 6 children. By the time that plane landed in Los Angeles, the marriage was over. Angelina Jolie filed for divorce days later. What actually happened in the air between France and California would stay mostly hidden from the public for the next 6 years, and when it finally surfaced, it didn't come out in a tabloid. It came out in federal documents and a sworn court filing. This is the story of what was actually said, what was actually alleged, and why a Hollywood divorce turned into one of the longest legal fights in celebrity history. For years, the public version of this story was simple. 2 movie stars fell out of love, and it got messy. That was the framing right up until August 2022, when NBC News obtained a redacted FBI report describing the Bureau's investigation into that 2016 flight. According to that report, Jolie told investigators Pitt had accused her of ruining this family during a confrontation that turned physical aboard the jet. 2 months after the flight, federal prosecutors decided not to pursue charges. The Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services investigated separately and also took no action against Pitt. 4 years, that was where the public record stopped. An investigation that opened and then closed quietly, with no charges filed. Then, in October 2022, the story deepened. As part of an unrelated lawsuit over the family's French winery, Jolie's attorneys filed a cross-complaint that went further than anything made public before. According to NPR's reporting on that filing, Jolie alleged that during the flight Pitt grabbed her by the head and shook her, then choked one of their children and struck another child who tried to intervene. CNN's reporting on the same filing described an allegation that Pitt lunged at one of the children and that Jolie physically pulled him back. A representative for Pitt disputed the account at the time, telling reporters the filing was, in their words, another rehash meant only to cause harm. That denial matters. So does the fact that this filing wasn't the criminal case. It was a civil cross-complaint, filed in a dispute about a winery, not a courtroom built to determine guilt or innocence in the flight incident itself. That's an important distinction, and it's one that got lost in a lot of the coverage at the time. A cross-complaint is an allegation made under oath, filed strategically inside a different lawsuit. It is not, on its own, proof. But it also isn't nothing. Under California law, knowingly filing false statements in a legal document carries serious consequences, which is part of why legal analysts treated the specificity of the filing as significant. So what do we actually know, without speculating? We know the FBI investigated. We know the investigation closed without charges. We know Jolie filed for divorce within days of that flight. We know that 6 years later, her legal team put explicit, detailed allegations on the public record. And we know Pitt has never stopped denying them. In September 2021, a year before the detailed court filing became public, Jolie sat down with The Guardian to promote a book she'd co-written about children's legal rights. The interview wasn't really about her divorce. But reporters asked anyway, and she gave them almost nothing. Just one line, which she repeated in some form across several public appearances over those years, that her focus was on her family healing. At the time, plenty of outlets treated that as a tired PR line, the kind of vague, diplomatic non-answer celebrities give when they don't want to fight in public. And to be fair, it is that. Publicists coach clients to say exactly this kind of thing. But look at the sequencing. She said it in 2021. The federal investigation had already happened, quietly, years earlier. The detailed cross-complaint hadn't been filed yet. So for years, the only public information anyone had was a redacted FBI file most people didn't even know existed, and one woman quietly repeating that she wanted her family to heal, without ever explaining, publicly, what there was to heal from. It's worth being careful here, because it would be easy to read too much into a single quote. People give guarded, generic answers in press interviews all the time, especially in the middle of active litigation where lawyers are almost certainly advising them on exactly what they can and can't say. A quote like that doesn't prove anything about what happened on a plane 5 years earlier. What it does show is a pattern. For the better part of a decade, Jolie's public statements on the divorce were remarkably restrained, especially compared to how much of the actual legal record eventually became public. That restraint is itself notable, if only because it cuts against the bitter ex narrative that dominated tabloid coverage of the divorce for years. Whatever was actually happening behind the scenes, Jolie wasn't the one feeding a media circus. By February 2022, the story most people were following had almost nothing to do with the flight. Brad Pitt filed a lawsuit in Los Angeles Superior Court over Chateau Miraval, the French estate the couple had bought together in 2008, restored over years, and were married on in 2014. Jolie had sold her half of the property in 2021, without Pitt's sign-off, to Tenuta del Mondo, a company tied to Russian businessman Yuri Shefler. Pitt's suit claimed the two of them had an unwritten understanding that neither would sell their stake without the other's consent, and that Jolie had broken it. The detail about the buyer's ties to Shefler wasn't incidental. Outlets covering the case, including CNN, noted it added a geopolitical wrinkle to what would otherwise have been a straightforward property dispute, though nothing in the public record ever established that the sale posed any actual security concern. It mostly functioned as a way to make the sale look more suspicious in headlines. Jolie's team's response, filed later that year, denied any binding agreement ever existed. No written contract, according to her filing. And that cross-complaint is the same filing that carried the detailed flight allegations described above. In other words, the winery lawsuit is the vehicle that finally put the flight allegations on the public record, 6 years after the fact. It's fair to ask why. One read is cynical, that raising abuse allegations inside a property dispute is a legal tactic, a way to shift a jury's or the public's sympathy in an unrelated financial fight. Pitt's team's response, calling it a rehash meant to cause harm, leaned into exactly that read. Another read is more sympathetic, that Jolie had spent years trying to negotiate a quiet exit from joint ownership of a property tied to painful memories, that Pitt refused every offer, and that selling to a third party was the only way out she had left. Reporting at the time suggested she'd been trying to divest for years before the 2021 sale. Both of those things can be true at once. Legal strategy and personal history aren't mutually exclusive, and it's worth resisting the urge to flatten this into a single clean motive. What's not in dispute is the outcome. A winery worth, by outside estimates, well over $100 million became the site of a bitter, years-long legal fight that ran in parallel with, and eventually became the vehicle for, the abuse allegations from 2016. Before the winery lawsuit ever existed, there was a custody fight. And it's easy to forget, given how much attention the Miraval case eventually got, that this was the arena where the flight allegations first mattered legally. In the years after the 2016 filing, a privately appointed judge, John Ouderkirk, was assigned to handle the family's custody proceedings behind closed doors, as is common in high-profile California divorces. In 2021, reporting indicated Ouderkirk had initially moved toward giving Pitt significantly more time with the couple's minor children. Jolie's legal team pushed back, not on the substance of the ruling, but on the judge himself. Her attorneys petitioned a California appeals court to disqualify Ouderkirk, arguing he had undisclosed prior business relationships with members of Pitt's legal team. The appeals court agreed. Ouderkirk was removed, and his earlier ruling was nullified, effectively resetting the custody proceedings. Pitt's side called the move a stalling tactic at the time. Whatever the intent, the practical effect was that a custody outcome favorable to Pitt was wiped off the board before it ever became final. This matters for understanding the shape of the whole saga, because it shows the legal fight was never really just two tracks, divorce and winery. It was at least three: the divorce itself, the custody arrangement for 6 children, and the property dispute. Each of those tracks moved at different speeds, stalled for different reasons, and occasionally bled into each other, which is part of why a simple divorce dragged on for the better part of a decade. By 2019, 3 years after Jolie's initial filing, a judge had ruled the two of them legally single, even though the underlying divorce, property division, support, and the custody questions still tied up in appeals remained unresolved. That gap between legally single and actually divorced is unusual, and it's a big part of why so much of the public conversation about this case has been confused for years. Jolie and Pitt were technically both free to remarry long before their divorce was, in the legal sense, finished. Here's a detail that got surprisingly little attention when it happened. In April 2022, someone filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against the FBI, anonymously as Jane Doe, seeking the release of the Bureau's file on a 2016 incident. Reporters at Politico and later, other outlets pieced together that the filer was almost certainly Jolie, based on details in the case that matched her divorce filing. A judge declined to keep that lawsuit sealed. That's how a redacted version of the FBI's report, the one describing the ruining this family comment and the physical confrontation, became public in August 2022, ahead of the more detailed court filing that October. Jolie kept that FOIA fight against the federal government going for more than 2 years. She finally dropped it in September 2024, agreeing that each side would cover its own legal costs, according to Fox News and other outlets that reviewed the filing. By then, the report had already been public for 2 years, and the more detailed allegations had already been filed. Her attorneys had said at various points that the goal of the request was to get a fuller account of the investigation, not to reopen the criminal case, which had already been closed for years by that point. That's a strange kind of legal fight to walk away from once you've already gotten most of what you wanted. It suggests the underlying goal was never really about extracting new information from the government. It was about making sure a version of the record existed publicly and outside of sealed divorce paperwork. It's also worth noting what the FBI itself said, on the record, when the redacted report first surfaced in 2022. A Bureau spokesperson told CNN at the time that no charges had been filed, that all parties had had access to this information for nearly 6 years, and that it had already been used in prior legal proceedings, a pointed way of saying there was nothing procedurally new in the report resurfacing publicly, even though the public was seeing it for the first time. A source close to Pitt went further, describing the renewed attention as a media stunt intended to cause pain rather than serve any legal purpose. That's a useful reminder that new to the public and new to the case are two very different things. Large parts of this file had already been reviewed, litigated around, and closed years before most people ever heard about it. On December 30, 2024, Jolie and Pitt signed a default declaration in Los Angeles Superior Court, confirming they'd reached a full written agreement on their marital and property rights. A judge approved it the next day. No press conference, no joint statement. Just a filing, followed by a short statement from Jolie's attorney, James Simon, who told the Associated Press she'd spent the years since 2016 focused on finding peace and healing for their family, and that she was, in his word, exhausted. CNN reported that financial terms weren't disclosed, and neither were the custody arrangements for the couple's 2 minor children at the time. 8 years and roughly 3.5 months after Jolie filed for divorce, it was over, legally at least. Pitt addressed it publicly for the first time 5 months later, in a GQ interview tied to the release of his film F1. Asked whether the finalized divorce brought him any sense of relief, he was notably muted. He said it hadn't felt like a major event, just something finally coming to fruition. Legally. It's a strikingly flat way to describe the end of an 8-year legal war, and it stands in sharp contrast to the language Jolie's side used around the same milestone. Nothing about the settlement resolved the underlying dispute over what happened on that plane in 2016. No court ever ruled on the abuse allegations one way or the other. Pitt was never criminally charged. No civil judgment was ever entered against him for the incident. The FBI's investigation and the county's separate child welfare investigation both closed without action years before any of this became public. Everything in the 2022 filing remains, legally speaking, an allegation, contested by Pitt, unresolved by any court. Pitt has also spoken in that same GQ conversation about his life in the years since, his relationship with Ines de Ramon, his return to high-profile public appearances, and his work on F1. None of that erases or resolves the allegations from the 2022 filing, but it's a reminder that both people involved in this story have spent the last several years living full, separate lives while the legal case dragged along in the background, largely out of public view except for the occasional filing. So what's the honest takeaway here? Not the sensational one, the accurate one? It's this. The public version of the Jolie Pitt divorce and the legal record version of it were, for years, almost completely different stories. The public got a tabloid narrative about a messy split. The legal record, once parts of it became public in 2022, described a specific, serious, and still disputed allegation of family violence, investigated by federal and county authorities years before most people knew it existed. Neither of those things cancels the other out. An allegation isn't a conviction. A denial isn't proof of innocence. What actually happened on that flight in September 2016 is something only the people on that plane know for certain, and the legal system, for all the years it spent on this case, never definitively settled it. What we can say with confidence is this. Jolie spent years being extremely guarded in public about a case that, once details emerged, turned out to be far more serious than the celebrity breakup framing suggested. Pitt spent years denying allegations that were serious enough to trigger a federal investigation. And a property they built together became, almost by accident, the legal mechanism that forced those allegations into public view. 8 years. 6 children who grew up in the middle of it. 1 winery. 1 FBI file. And, in the end, 1 quiet filing on a Tuesday in December, closing a chapter that never really got a clean resolution. Just an ending. There's also a broader lesson here about how these stories move through the public sphere. In 2016, when Jolie filed for divorce, most coverage treated it as a straightforward celebrity split, the kind of story that gets a news cycle and then fades. It took a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, an unrelated property dispute, and 6 years of quiet legal maneuvering before the public had any real sense of what had actually been alleged. That's not unusual for high-profile family law cases involving wealthy, well-represented parties. Sealed records, private judges, and non-disclosure agreements are all standard tools in this kind of litigation, and they exist specifically to keep exactly this sort of material out of public view for as long as possible. What made this case different is that the material got out anyway, not through a leak or a tabloid scoop, but through the ordinary mechanics of litigation, a FOIA request that wasn't sealed, and a cross-complaint filed in a fight over grapevines. Neither of those was designed to be a vehicle for public disclosure. They just ended up functioning as one. That's probably the most honest way to sum up this whole saga. A private family conflict that became public almost by accident, through the side doors of an unrelated lawsuit and a records request, rather than through any deliberate campaign by either side. Whatever actually happened on that plane in September 2016 remains, legally, unresolved. An allegation that was serious enough to trigger a federal investigation, and specific enough to reshape a family's next 8 years, but never tested in a courtroom built to decide whether it was true. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments which part of the timeline surprised you most, and subscribe for more grounded, source-based deep dives into stories the headlines usually oversimplify.